Everywhere you go in the world, you'll find monuments to a different age. From the earliest settlements to the new millennium, every civilization has left its mark. These great historic sites give us fascinating insight into the way people lived and the kind of world they lived in.
In this Globe Trekker special, we'll be traveling across Europe to the Middle East, South Africa, the Far East, Australasia, and the USA, visiting sites dating from the mid-19th century right up to the present day. Joining Megan McCormick on this tour of great historic sites of the modern world are Justine Shapiro, Holly Morris, Katie Haswell, Adela Ukar, Sammy Sabiti, and Ian Wright. In the late 19th century, the USA was a young country on the rise. At places such as Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, the Little Bighorn in Montana, and Bodie in California, dramatic nation-shaping events have left a legacy of great historic sites. Megan McCormick visits Gettysburg, site of the famous speech given in 1863 by President Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War.
The northern town of Gettysburg found itself the accidental home of one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. A staggering 11 soldiers a minute died here. Over 5,000 reenactors from both sides of the war gathered to retrace the steps their ancestors would have taken, marching into battle and for many to certain death. It was on this day, the 19th of November in 1863, that President Lincoln came to Gettysburg to officially bury and mourn for his Union men who had died here. He used the occasion to give a very short but very powerful speech. It was only 272 words, and it managed somehow to transform the horrors of the Gettysburg battle into a symbol for the sacrifice of war. Although there were many issues that actually triggered the war, the single most important cause was slavery. The southern states were determined to hang on to their slaves, but the newly elected president, Abraham Lincoln, was deeply opposed to their inhuman practices.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Corporal William H. Myers, E Company, 62nd.
At the end of the day, a candle is lit for every soldier buried at the Gettysburg Cemetery, so that the memory of those who gave their lives may never be extinguished. Over 600,000 men died. It was actually a tragedy of national proportion. However, there was one extremely positive thing that came out of that, in that slavery was abolished. And despite 4 years of incredible bloodshed and hatred, the Unionists and the Confederates managed to unite and form the United States of America.
Despite the fine words of the Gettysburg Address, giving equality to all Americans did not include asking the American Indians how they wanted to live. Instead, the native tribes of the Wild West were ruthlessly pushed off their ancestral lands by the military might of the U.S. cavalry. Today, it's possible to visit many of the battlefields of the Indian Wars. The Battle of the Little Bighorn was a rare Native American victory, where General George Custer, a veteran of the Civil War, made his last stand. Ian Wright visits the historic site of the battle in modern-day Montana.
In 1876, General Custer and his cavalry were massacred by 2,000 Sioux warriors defending their territory from the gold-hungry whites. Gerald Baker is a park ranger whose family has lived on this land for generations.
The majority of the fighting with George Custer and his 7th Cavalry, where they got killed, is right through this location. You can see the stone markers where the people fell, the soldiers fell. And they always say the end of the battle took place on top of the hill, which is a real good place for the hero to be at. In fact, some of the Indian tribes that fought here, some of their oral traditions say that George Custer was one of the first ones to go, one of the first ones to get killed. And it wasn't the last one with the blazing guns and this type of thing.
How many did they lose then, the 7th Cavalry?
The 227 were killed with this. There's also some lost over in the Reno-Benteen battle.
Right.
And so there was, up to almost 300 people died.
Did this signify like how the West was won, do you think?
What this battle signifies to a lot of tribes and to a lot of individuals is a change of life. It was an end of an era that meant that we couldn't roam anymore and follow buffalo herds and exist that way. So it was an end of a lifestyle.
The tide of change in the American West was relentless. The California Gold Rush and even the Colorado Silver Rush attracted vast numbers of settlers hoping to strike it rich. New railroads built on the profits brought in even more settlers. Today, many historic sites from this era can be visited all across the West. In 1876, the same year as the Battle of the Little Bighorn, huge deposits of gold were discovered in the remote settlement of Bodie in California. Today, it's a National Historic Landmark. Justine Shapiro takes a look around.
In less than 20 years, it became the 3rd largest city in the state of California. And when the gold ran out, the town died and turned into a ghost town. Hi, I'm Justine.
I'm Brad. Glad to meet you.
Good to meet you.
Come with me. I'll show you around.
Great.
At its height, 10,000 people lived in Bodie, but in the 1930s, a great fire burnt much of the town to the ground.
And this has all been left the way it was after what point?
Last operated about the early 1940s. This is one of probably 65 saloons in Bodie at its heyday.
65 saloons in Bodie.
65.
So how did it work? They went and worked at the mines in the morning.
Right. They get their $4 a day paid and spend them on roulette games or card games of some sort, or ladies of the evening, and be broke by the next day. Some things never change.
Women, alcohol, and money.
Yes.
Bodie had the reputation of being a tough, lawless town with at least one gunfight every day. They say the funeral bell rang continuously.
While the Wild West was being tamed, the East boomed. Welcomed by the Statue of Liberty, erected in 1886, a tide of European immigrants poured into New York Harbor in pursuit of the American dream. Hand in hand with the riches that could be freely made in the East's fast-growing cities came a new and dynamic style of building. One of the eastern United States' fastest developing new cities was Chicago. In the late 19th century, it was the historic birthplace of the modern skyscraper, as Justine Shapiro discovers.
Chicago skyscrapers rose from the ashes of a great fire in 1871, which razed the entire city to the ground.
This is the Monadnock Building. But in 1891, just 20 years after the city was burned to the ground, this was the tallest building in the world. At the time, most of the buildings around here were 5 stories tall. So when this thing went up, people were amazed.
At 16 stories tall, the Monadnock Building was in its time the world's largest office building. And even today, it's still the world's tallest commercial building structurally supported only by bricks. Down the road from the Monadnock is the Manhattan Building. Also built in 1891, it's about the same height, but its walls conceal an internal steel frame, a revolutionary design that in time would allow buildings to be raised to extraordinary heights. 20th century America would become famous for its huge skyscrapers, but in the late 19th century, the greatest expression of what steel technology could do was created across the Atlantic in Paris, France. Adela Ucar takes a look around one of the world's most iconic structures.
The Eiffel Tower was built in 1889 for the World Fair by engineer Gustave Eiffel. 2.5 million rivets hold together 18,000 pieces of metal. On a clear day from up here, you can see for miles and miles and miles, and at night it twinkles.
Standing over 1,000 feet tall, as high as an 80-story building, the Eiffel Tower was the tallest man-made structure in the world for all of 41 years, from 1889 until 1930. Soaring confidently into the sky, the hugely ambitious Eiffel Tower is a prime symbol of how radically modern late 19th century European culture could be. Beyond Paris, the most remarkable example of late 19th century modernist architecture is to be found in Barcelona, Spain. The Sagrada Familia Church, begun in 1883, is the masterpiece of the world-famous modernista architect Antonio Gaudí. Gaudí spent decades on the Sagrada Familia, but the project was so incredibly ambitious that it remained unfinished when he died. Today, it's still being completed along the lines it's believed he would have wanted. Megan McCormick takes a look around.
There it is! Gaudí designed 3 facades in his lifetime. The Nativity, facing east, adorned with symbols of creation. In the north, the apse, crawling with diabolical reptiles trying but failing to enter the sacred interior, and Passion, located on the west, where the day ends and death rears its ugly head. Hope, faith, and charity. These are the themes that obsess Gaudí. Images of the New Testament abound, bell towers representing the apostles, heaven and hell carved out in sculptures. "400 twisting, snail-shaped steps take you up to the top of the tower. It's a dizzying experience." Oh, this is incredible! It is so grand in scale and so aspirational. You know, this is Gaudí's final work, and it is triumphant. It's amazing to think that the church won't be completed until 2026, 100 years after Gaudí's death.
The remarkably modern Sagrada Familia was part of a forward-thinking golden age of European culture, known as the Belle Epoque. But in 1914, this optimistic era came to a shuddering end, with the outbreak of World War I. During 4 years of horrific conflict between Germany on one side and Britain and France on the other, around 10 million soldiers were killed. Today, All along the former front lines, historic World War I battlefields can be visited. Ypres in Belgium was one of the bloodiest battlefields, as Katie Haswell finds out.
Dave, we're on the German ridge, is that correct?
Yes.
And Ypres is what, 5 miles over that way?
Absolutely right.
What happened here?
What is basically happening, as you said, 5 miles in that direction is Ypres. High ground is occupied by the Germans. They are launching an attack from behind the back of the wall here, the ridge, and they are throwing in 6 million shells at Ypres. 6 million. On one battle out here, we lost 245,000 men on that single attack. 95,000 guys still lay out there somewhere.
Look at this boy here. He was 16 years old when he fell.
16 years old.
It's a baby.
Absolutely. What do you know at the age of 16?
Nothing.
Nothing.
There are over 150 war cemeteries in Ypres. They're everywhere you look. But perhaps the most moving are the tiny cemeteries you'll find scattered amongst the countryside and woodland areas. Many of these were created during the battle, burying the soldiers literally where they fell. In some areas, the trenches and tunnels of war remain to this day.
So this looks exactly as it did?
Exactly the same.
Exactly as it was when they literally climbed out of this.
Correct, and walked away from the place.
Many of the young men died of disease in the squalid mud and filth of the trenches.
This hill here cost the lives of 55,000 men over 4 years of the war. It's very difficult to explain.
It's almost impossible to imagine what this must have been like.
Ypres was so affected by the Great War that to this day crowds gather at 8 o'clock every evening at the Menin Gate Monument. The traffic is stopped and the buglers play the last post in honor of those who gave their lives.
For most of World War I, Britain and France were allied with Russia. But that changed in 1917 when a communist uprising in the major cities of St. Petersburg and Moscow brought down the Russian monarchy. The great historic sites of the Communist Revolution are visited by Ian Wright.
St. Petersburg is the second biggest city in Russia, with a population of 5 million. Until the Russian Revolution in 1917, it was the capital. With my guide, Nikolai, I went to the former home of the Tsars, the Winter Palace. Wow, this is absolutely ridiculous. Look at that.
It's a marvelous place.
It's a serious staircase, isn't it? That's no half measures there.
Yeah, that's right.
Man.
It looks the same as it used to look back in the 18th century.
Really?
It wasn't rebuilt. It's the same look. It was built for Catherine.
For Catherine the Great?
Catherine the Great,
Yeah,
Catherine
yeah.
II, yeah.
So no one would come in, this would be a little chill-out place.
Yeah, right.
But to be honest, she didn't need this many chandeliers, did she? And that's just being greedy, no? It was across this square, on the night of the 25th of October 1917, the revolutionaries stormed the Winter Palace, arresting the government and putting in its place the Soviet regime, with Lenin as its leader. Wow, so the revolution almost started here.
It didn't start here. It was over here. You know,
Right.
the last things and revolutions were done on the
finished.
square.
Moscow. Seen a lot of changes recently, but it's hard to forget that for 70 years, this was the capital of world communism. Many towns in Russia have a Kremlin. The word actually means fortress, but this is the only one that counts for me. It's the place where every Western spy would risk their life to gain access. Outside the Kremlin's east wall is Red Square. In the shadow of St. Basil's Cathedral, this is the place where the Red Army paraded its tanks and missiles to impress its leaders and frighten the world. This is it, I can't believe I'm here, it's great. This is the famous Red Square. And it was named Red Square years before the communists took over because it means beautiful in Russia, and it's true. Look, you've got the church back there. This is the massive gum department store. Go shopping there. I think that's a museum. And could just make it out. That's the Kremlin there. And that there, Lenin's tomb. It's got the lot. When Lenin died in 1924, the Russian people couldn't imagine life without him. So they had him embalmed and put him in a display case. This turned the man into an icon of the revolution, and within a few years, there was a statue of him in every Russian town. Keeping the body preserved is a huge operation, but there's no longer a political need to preserve the memory. Word is that one day soon they'll bury Lenin in a normal grave, and finally laying to rest the last remnant of the Bolshevik Revolution. Well, I've done it all now. The Kremlin, Red Square, and Lenin's tomb. Save that one till last. That was weird, and it looks like a waxwork dummy.
Amongst Moscow's many historic sites is an extraordinary collection of communist-era Gothic skyscrapers.
You've got the hammer and sickles on both sides, you've got the star at the top, and different layers. That's why it's nicknamed the wedding cake. Better than that, it's my hotel. Because it's never been much of a tourist town, Moscow doesn't have many cheap places to stay for travellers. So the Hotel Ukraine is the sort of place you'll end up in. Good old-fashioned Soviet accommodation from a bygone era. But this is what I'm paying the money for. Look at that. I feel like I'm in some gothic horror movie.
Moscow's communist-era skyscrapers are spectacular, but in terms of building them as high as possible, the Soviet architects were no match for their capitalist foes in the United States. New York, in particular, is home to a fabulous collection of skyscrapers. The neo-Gothic Woolworth Building, commissioned by nickel and dime store magnate Frank Woolworth, was the world's tallest for 17 years, until the end of the 1920s. Megan McCormick checks out New York's other most historic skyscrapers.
Frank Woolworth was the first, but many more followed. In 1929, there was a race between two parties to build the next world's tallest. Downtown, there was 40 Wall Street for the Bank of Manhattan. And in Midtown, the Chrysler Building, Walter Chrysler's stunning Art Deco masterpiece. 40 Wall Street has the dubious title of being the tallest building in the world for the least amount of time, a mere week. This was until Walter Chrysler found out it was going to be taller than his building, so he added height to his with a two-piece spire, beating the Bank of Manhattan by 119 feet. After the 1929 crash, architecture sobered up and buildings became more about function than status. However, one building erected in the Great Depression still dominates the Midtown skyline. John Jacob Raskop's world-famous building, built in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, I know it's around here somewhere. Ah, the Empire State Building. Built 20 blocks from the business district, it was doomed to be a financial failure. It started with a pencil that Raskop placed on one end and said to his principal architect, William Lamb, "How high can you build it so it won't fall down?" I guess the answer came back,
pretty darn high.
But the building itself was a masterpiece. 3,400 workers took just 13 months to complete it. New Yorkers watched in awe as it rose so rapidly from the ground. A proud symbol of New York's resilience, it didn't make a profit for a quarter of a century, but stood as the world's tallest building for 40 years.
The Chrysler Building had only briefly held the title of the world's tallest building. But its spectacular Art Deco design proved much more enduring and was popular worldwide throughout the 1930s. Beyond New York, two of the best places in the world to see historic Art Deco buildings are Miami Beach in Florida and, oddly enough, the small town of Napier in New Zealand. Both places were substantially rebuilt according to the latest Art Deco fashion after being devastated by natural disasters, in Miami's case by a hurricane in 1926. Today, in just a small area around the iconic Ocean Drive, Miami Beach boasts over 400 registered historic landmarks from the heyday of Art Deco. In New Zealand, the town of Napier was similarly transformed following a massive earthquake in 1931. Art Deco enthusiast John Gawking explains what happened.
The whole town centre was destroyed in 2.5 minutes, and they rebuilt the town in 2 years, so they got a little snapshot in time. And they wanted to build the most modern city in the world, the most up-to-date that they could, so they chose Art Deco. It's a very geometric style, after the Art Nouveau style, which was very natural, using natural forms. This is all born on the drawing board, so diamonds, circles, straight lines, very geometric. Strangely, they want to be the most modern design in the world, but they used ancient cultures as an inspiration. Tutankhamun's tomb had been opened in 1923, so suddenly everything Egyptian was really trendy. The optimism and grit of the people that gave us the most wonderful little jewel. It's like having a jewel. You just have to look after it and it'll be worth more every single day.
The historic architecture of Napier and Miami Beach was the result of sudden natural disasters. But in 1939, a man-made catastrophe that lasted for 6 years utterly transformed the entire world. The seeds of war were sown in Germany in the mid-1930s. In the city of Nuremberg, Hitler paraded his fascist vision for the future of the Third Reich. Megan McCormick is given a tour.
Close to the Congress Hall, beside a grand avenue, is the Zeppelin stand. It was here that Hitler staged the militaristic Nazi Party rallies that gripped the German nation and set the country on the path to war. I take a look around with World War II expert John Jenkins.
This is actually where Hitler stood on the speaker's platform here. Yes, yeah.
Well, this is so familiar from newsreels. Okay, this is actually where Hitler stood.
Yeah.
Can you give me an idea of what it must have been like for him?
This arena was the scene for a number of ceremonies that were, all of them were extremely impressive. About 150,000 people in the field.
150,000 people
with
out
spectators,
here.
Of course. A typical ceremony would have much marching, standing to attention, everything coordinated. Nothing ever went wrong during these ceremonies, and it was extremely impressive. In the early days, the idea was, well, this man's going to do something for Germany, and I want to be part of that, and I want to be part of this national movement.
And now it's kind of strange, isn't it? Because all of this took place here, and these days you've got people rollerblading, bicycling, parents pushing babies in their carriage as if nothing really happened here.
Hitler, of course, went on to invade Poland in 1939, plunging the world into war. By the time Germany was defeated in 1945, over 50 million people had been killed. Of the dead, around 6 million were Jews, murdered in a Nazi campaign of genocide. In Poland, at the former Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp, visitors are encouraged never to forget what happened at one of history's most tragic sites, as Justine Shapiro discovers.
Like many Jewish Americans, I have Polish roots, and the Auschwitz concentration camp was the place where many of my relatives died during World War II. What remains of the concentration camp is a museum, and Jardshaw Mensfeld is one of the regular tour guides here.
What kinds of reactions do you get from the visitors?
It's the whole range, I would say, from total indifference to people breaking in tears. And most often, on the average, just people are shocked. That's true. Some of them cry, especially when seeing the baby clothes or the suitcases with the birth dates. 7 tons of the human hair were found by the Soviets. It was sold as raw material. 2 pounds of this cost half a rice mark. It was a real bargain. And what was made with the hair, we can see here in the showcase, was a hair cloth. As a fabric, it is a very good one, resistant and so on. The only problem is that, it was made from humans. Otherwise, very good for mattresses. Before the war, it was a munition storehouse for the Polish army. And in 42, gas chamber, the first one, a very primitive one. Only 500 people could be murdered at the time. In 43, Birkenau was ready, so they stopped cremating and gassing here, and everything went there. Birkenau was really something. That was an industrial level. Always this question arises, have we learned anything from Auschwitz? Well, somebody said that to forget is to repeat. If you say, I'm not a Jew, I'm not interested in it, then you're making a big mistake. Because things like Holocaust start in a very innocent way. Just somebody writes a book, and then little by little, we have where we are now, Auschwitz.
In August 1945, 3 months after the end of the war in Europe, the USA dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to force Germany's ally Japan to surrender. Amazed by the new weapon's terrifying power, the Soviet Union now devoted years of scientific effort to mastering the technology themselves. In the USA, Ian Wright visits the historic former nuclear test site in Nevada.
In 1949, 4 years after Hiroshima, the Russians announced that they too had nuclear capability. The arms race was on. Because of its isolation, warm and dry climate, the Nevada desert was chosen as the testing ground for US nuclear weapons. On January the 27th, 1951, the first airborne atomic test was detonated over Frenchman Flat. It's just phenomenal. I can't even get my head around it. But look, you see where that white structure is there? That's ground zero, where they actually did one of the first atomic tests. The device was dropped from a B-52 bomber that flew out of the airbase in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I'm being met for a tour by my official atomic guide.
This was a bank vault that was built and constructed to see how it would survive a nuclear blast. Wow. As you can see, the forces of the wind and the pressures stripped a lot of the concrete and rebar off the edge. Yeah. And surprisingly enough, the door was intact.
Whole dummy towns were built within the blast zone. Needless to say, they were destroyed in milliseconds. Holy baloney, look at the size of that crater, that's massive.
This is Sedan Crater, about 1,280 feet across, 325 feet deep.
Yeah.
This crater was created by burying a nuclear device about 600 feet underground.
How nuts is this? These benches there, this is where the VIPs used to come and sit and watch the show over there 8 miles that way, and the show being like an atomic bomb going off. And you get a massive heat wave that hit you. Next thing to come would be the shock wave, and you'd see it coming along. And then after that, and only after that, you'd actually hear the noise from the bomb going off. Honestly, it's insanity. It's just so wrong.
Thousands of miles from the U.S. nuclear test site in Nevada, the military base at Pervomaisk in the Soviet Union was one of scores of Soviet missile sites also ready to launch nuclear war. Today, the former base is open to the public as the Museum of the Strategic Rocket Troops, a historic reminder of the threat that the world faced throughout the Cold War. Holly Morris has given a tour of this once top-secret site.
What's this one called?
Как называется эта ракета?
Ракета Сатан.
Satan.
Satan.
Edward Sabirov, my guide, assisted by Ilya, an English translator, was once one of the officers who was assigned to this base.
And this is the shaft?
Да, ракетная шахта или то, что от нее осталось.
Rather, what's left of it.
And the missiles that were in here, were they armed with the nuclear tips?
Ядерными боевыми головками.
Yes, they were armed with 10 nuclear warheads.
And then how long does it take for the missile to get to, say, the U.S.?
30 минут достаточно и будет.
30 minutes should be enough.
Thank you.
When on duty, the officers waited deep underground, lodged in a long, tube-like shaft designed to withstand a nuclear attack from the enemy and provide enough oxygen, food, and water to last for 45 days. We descend the equivalent of 12 stories. Only 2 or 3 people are allowed at a time in the tiny elevator.
This is the post number 1 for the commander of the military.
So you were in charge of 10 nuclear missiles from this site alone.
Firing a missile required 4 hands operating at once. First, you had to verify secret codes from Moscow kept locked in a safe. Then both of you had to simultaneously turn a special key at precisely the same second. Then it boiled down to the button, the one you've seen in all the movies. It's still there. It's not red, it's gray. Edward sat in this chair for years, but thankfully never had to push the button.
Happily, the Cold War's most dangerous years, the 1950s and 60s, passed into history without nuclear Armageddon. Back in the USA, Americans could safely devote themselves to one of their favorite pastimes, making enough money to put up the world's tallest buildings. In 1973, the city of Chicago surpassed New York in America's own private skyscraper contest. The newly completed Sears Tower, with its 108 stories, standing a staggering 1,451 feet tall, would hold the title of the world's tallest building for another 25 years. Beyond Chicago, innovative modern buildings transformed many of the world's leading cities in the late 20th century, such as Sydney in Australia. Completed in 1973, the same year as the Sears Tower, the Sydney Opera House is one of the world's most iconic buildings. Justine Shapiro finds out more.
That looks like a professional camera. Is this good light to film?
Perfect light. And it doesn't really matter with this building. It's, you know, you can photograph it at any time of the day or any time of the night from anywhere in Sydney. You'll always get a good shot. It's kind of fail-proof architectural photography. That's fantastic.
How much did it cost to build this?
It ended up costing just over 100 million Australian dollars, which certainly was more than the original budget, which I think was around $10 million, I think. It was originally an architectural competition that people from all around the world entered, and it was won by a young Danish architect, Jørn Utzon. It didn't go very smoothly. There were concerns, I think, mainly from the government about budget blowouts and the thing costing too much money and taking too long to build. Unfortunately, Utzon was really put in a position where he had to leave. He just had to walk off the job. They didn't pay him what he was due.
Utzon returned to Denmark while the Opera House was still under construction. Sadly, he died in 2008 without ever having returned to Australia to see his finished masterpiece. Back in Europe, dramatic changes came in 1989 as the Iron Curtain that had divided Europe since 1945 was swept away by a wave of anti-communist revolutions. In Berlin, people power toppled the fearsome and hugely symbolic Berlin Wall. Justine Shapiro sees what little is left of one of the modern world's greatest historic sites.
When the wall was still standing, there was 100 miles of it. And 25 miles of the wall ran through Berlin. Today, there's just about a mile left of the wall, and on this section, the murals are just crumbling and falling to bits. But in the year 2000, they started reconstructing the murals on that side of the wall.
This section of the wall is known as the East Side Gallery. These paintings were created by artists from all over the world. Just behind the wall is a man called Gigi who sells bits and pieces of it. Gigi chiseled off whole chunks of the wall and stored them in his basement, and he can show you exactly where your fragment comes from.
Are you still allowed to break down the wall?
No. Actually, it's very important to keep that part of the wall what's still standing here. This is the longest what we have. Here you can get the best impression how hard was the wall through the city like a knife in a cake, east and west.
Yes.
And so terrible. All the divided families and so on.
During the 28 years that the wall encircled West Berlin, over 160 East Germans died trying to cross it. Now, the symbol of oppression is scattered across mantelpieces all over the world.
Soon after the collapse of the Iron Curtain in Europe, similarly historic events took place in racially divided South Africa. Sammy Sabiti tours the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg, whilst on Robben Island near Cape Town, Nelson Mandela's former prison cell is visited by Justine Shapiro.
Robben Island has been a symbol of oppression throughout the world, but now the warders and the ex-political prisoners have come together in a unique way to change that.
Ladies and gentlemen, you will be asked not smoking in the island.
Robben Island has a history of suffering. It was first used as an asylum and then a leper colony, and since the 18th century has served as a high-security prison. Its only other inhabitants are penguin and deer. The last prisoners left in November 1996.
This is the Apartheid Museum. It's perhaps the most important museum in the country. It was built as a lasting monument to the new South Africa and as a reminder that segregation of race as a system should never happen again. This place is a bastion of forgiveness.
I learned more from museum curator Christopher Till.
While discrimination has been part of this country for hundreds of years, formal apartheid came into being in 1948 when the National Party government came into power. And they set about a system of legislating discrimination into law. And what you can see in the museum is a list of all the laws that were put in place by the National Party government to keep people apart. hanging from the roof are these nooses, and each one represents someone who was hung for political activities. And the room on behind you over there was in fact Pretoria Central Prison, where these things were undertaken. And it takes to the heart of the matter the extent to which the apartheid government went to try and retain its own power and its own privilege.
Here, as you see, these are single cells. There are about 30 of them. That is where the leaders of the ANC were kept. They were separated from other prisoners because they were regarded as the most dangerous people in South Africa.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is cell number 5. This is where President Mandela used to stay. Now, in the beginning, there were no beds. We were sleeping on the floor.
So where are we now? Well, we're at the point where there's light at the end of the tunnel. Right. And we've reached the point where South Africa has lived through its nightmare and it's finally woken up into a new land. The images are happy images, and it's fabulous to show the new South Africa taking off, which is symbolized by the aircraft behind us, under the extraordinary persona of Nelson Mandela.
In the year 2000, as a new century and a new millennium dawned, naturally enough, there were high hopes that the new era would bring a better future. But in 2001, out of a beautiful clear blue autumn sky, those hopes came crashing down.
On September 11th, 2001, at 8:46 in the morning, the World Trade Center was hit by the first of 2 planes, which would, within a couple of hours, fell the Twin Towers and change American lives forever. "3,030 people died in the September 11th attacks. It's a day that will be remembered forever." Strangely, but perhaps not surprisingly, the area around Ground Zero has now become a major tourist attraction, with people flocking to see the site firsthand. I was lucky enough to meet Daniel Libeskind, who has the task of rebuilding the Ground Zero site. I've obviously never been able to see it from this perspective.
It's an amazing site, it is. I guess the vitality and beauty of New York is the kind of freedom to think about things in a free space and to think once again about what took place on this, the memory of that event, and at the same time to answer these evil events with things that are so positive. Because architecture, you know, it's the only art, I think, which is truly about optimism. And of course, that is the greatest challenge, to answer these evil deeds with something so positive and so compelling that it overwhelms these events and really gives back to New York a completely new neighborhood.
The USA has long been the modern world's most powerful nation, but the balance of power is beginning to shift in many different ways. Today, Arab Gulf states such as Dubai and booming Far Eastern countries such as China, Taiwan, and Malaysia are developing incredibly fast. In 1998, for the first time in 100 years, a building not in the USA became the world's tallest. At 1,483 feet high, the dramatic Petronas Towers in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, overtook the previous record holder, Chicago's Sears Tower, by just 30 feet. But Kuala Lumpur only held the record for 6 years. At first, it looked like Shanghai, home to thousands of huge new skyscrapers, would be the next Far Eastern city to claim the title. But while Shanghai's huge world financial center was still under construction, China was pipped to the post in 2004 by its island foe, Taiwan. The amazing Taipei 101 Tower is all of 1,671 feet high, but Taipei also only held the record for 6 years. In 2010, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai smashed the record for the world's tallest building by over 1,000 feet. The modern world's newest great historic site stands an extraordinary 160 stories tall at 2,716 feet. 50 years ago, nobody would have imagined that today such astonishing skyscrapers would be commonplace across much of the developing world. So who can possibly predict what the modern world's newest great historic sites will be in another 50 years from now? Only time will tell. You can find more about the series on our websites. Programs from the Globe Trekker series are available on DVD. Or visit globetrekkerchannel.tv to find out where you can watch us online. Music from the series is available on CD. You can also order Globe Trekker books featuring information on festivals, events, and outdoor activities. To order Globe Trekker products, visit the website globetrekkertv.com.